on demographic trends. What I want to start with today is a description of the basic demographic trends in immigration, just to give us a basis before we begin talking about immigrant health patterns. So immigration to the U.S. is typically cut into four main waves of immigration. And the first wave corresponds to the period prior to 1820. This is when mostly English arrived, so English Scots, Irish, Germans, and other Europeans. This is the period prior to 1820. Now our graphic begins in 1820, and this corresponds to wave 2 of immigration to the U.S. This wave roughly corresponds to the period between 1820 and 1860. And this is when mostly German, British, and Irish immigrants arrived to the U.S. 40% of immigrants during this period from 1820 to 1860 were Irish. 40% were Irish in the second wave of immigration. Then we get to wave 3, and this is what I keep referring to as the previous great wave of immigration. This period started in 1880 and roughly ran to 1919. During this period, more than 20 million Southern and Eastern European immigrants entered the United States, along with several 100,000 Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian laborers who mostly settled in Western states. After this third wave of immigration, the previous great wave of immigration, there was an immigration pause. This ran from about 1920 to 1964. Immigration fell during this period, during World War I. And then in the 1920s, immigration was curtailed by the introduction of limits or quotas on the number of immigrant visas available. Furthermore, during the 1930s, the Depression discouraged immigration. During the 40s and 50s, immigration from Mexico, in the absence of other forms of immigration from Mexico became increasingly important, largely due to the Bracero program. Then we get to wave 4, okay? And that begins in 1965. Immigrants began arriving to the U.S. after 1965 when the preference system changed. Okay? Immigration legislation was passed in 1965 that changed the preference system. The new system favored people whose U.S. relatives would sponsor them and whose skills were in demand by U.S. employers. This, as well as prosperity in Europe and strong ties to Mexico established during the Bracero program, really shifted the origin of U.S. immigrants from Europe to Latin America and Asia. And I will note that this slide that shows the 4 waves of immigration refers only to legal immigration. This is the only slide that I am referring to legal immigration. Throughout the rest of the talk, when I refer to the foreign-born or the immigrant population, I will be referring to the entire immigrant population regardless of legal status. But in this slide, it's looking just at the legal population. And when we see that spike corresponding to 1986, that does not correspond to an influx of immigrants to the country. That is when the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed in 1986, which granted amnesty to a segment of the unauthorized population. So those were immigrants that were already in the country, primarily from Mexico, in an unauthorized state, and were granted amnesty. So we see this bump. It looks like an increase in immigrants arriving into the United States, but it really is just adjustment of status from unauthorized to authorized, and potentially something we'll see again depending on what happens with the immigration legislation that's currently being considered by the government. Okay, so in this graphic we see how the foreign-born and the total population in the U.S. have changed over time. This runs from the mid-1850s, corresponds to the second wave of migration, all the way through 2008. So on the x-axis we see the year, and the dark blue bars correspond to the total number of immigrants in the U.S. population. The light blue bars are the total number of the U.S. population. And the yellow line shows the proportion of the total population that is foreign-born or immigrant. So some things to point out here, that we see some real similarities between immigration at the beginning of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century. Okay, so when we're comparing the previous great wave, the third wave of migration, to the fourth wave of contemporary migration that we're living in currently, that began in 1965. So the number of immigrants arriving annually is about the same, although the foreign-born population accounted for more of the U.S. population as a proportion of the U.S. population in 1900, when it was close to 15% of the U.S. population was immigrant, and in the current period, around 12%, up to 2008, around 12% of the total U.S. population is foreign-born. During both periods, the country, the U.S., was experiencing economic restructuring. So at the turn of last century, it was shifting from a primarily agricultural-based economy to industry, or industrial economy, and now we're moving from a service economy to an information-based economy. Both waves of migration brought people from countries that previously had not sent large numbers of immigrants. So the previous Great Wave, it was a shift in origins from Western Europeans to Southern and Eastern Europeans. And currently we're in a period where the shift in origins has shifted to Asia and Latin America. And these shifts have raised similar questions in both periods about language, religion, culture, and reassessments of immigration policy. This figure demonstrates the shift in origins that I've been referring to. So if you look at the first set of bars, this is the raw number of immigrants by decade and the source countries that they come from. And then if you look at the bottom set of bars, we see the total immigrant population currently, and we see the shift from predominantly European immigrants in the earlier wave to Latin American and Asian immigrants in the contemporary wave.